Hi, I'm Kaye Wood and welcome back to Kaye's Quilting Friends. On today's show, I'm going to show you how you can make a 6-hour quilt. I know a lot of you make quilts for charity, either for Children's Hospital or for nursing homes or some of these things. And believe me, the 6-hour quilt is my version of the charity quilt. It's quick and it's easy, it's washable, machine dryable. Let me just show you one of the quilts that I have here. They are all reversible. Here we have one side, we have the other side. And I want to show you exactly how easy it is to do that. Actually, I call it the 6-hour quilt, but because nobody would believe me if I said 4 hours. But after your first one, I think you'll see how it's easy to make it in just the 4 or 6 hours. I'm going to show you how to do it on a serger, but I'll also give you instructions on how you can do it on your home sewing machine. So either way, I think the serger's a little faster and it's a little more fun to do this technique on it. Now, if you're sewing quilts in a group for charity, I'd like to tell you a little bit about how you could set up this as an event. I travel around the country and we put on the Love Quilt event, it's called. That's where we ask you to sit down for 10 or 15 minutes, give us your time, and do a step on a quilt. And at the end of a 3 or 4 day event, we have somewhere between 60 and 75 finished quilts that are donated to a local hospital or a children's group or abuse center. So I wanted you to be able to take this idea and use it with your group. So to get started, what we need to do, of course, is to cut our fabric. And I have these really bright fabrics that are great for kids. If you're making it for nursing homes, you might want to, of course, maybe not use lizards and frogs and turtles like I've used, but use some other kinds of fabric. But we want to cut our strips, and they're cut 6 inches wide and the full length of the fabric. Then we need to cut our batting, and I want to talk a little bit about batting, because you can use just about any kind of batting in these quilts. However, if you use a really thick batting, you need to cut it a ½ inch wider than the measurements I'm going to give you. I have cut all of my strips of fabric and batting 6 inches wide. But if my batting, as I said, were really thick, I would need my batting cut 6½ inches. Now, there's another thing about batting. I know a lot of you may not realize that batting has a grain line. And in these quilts, we have long areas that are not quilted, and we have to use the batting in the right way to take care of that. Here I have a 6 inch wide strip of batting all ready to go in my quilt. And if you take a look at it, you can see it stretches quite a bit in one direction. If I stretch it this way, very little stretch. If you have a batting that you want to use that has stretch in one direction, then cut that the 6 inches. In other words, we don't want a long piece with the stretch going down, or the whole quilt will tend to stretch out of shape. Now, some battings don't stretch in either direction, and that's fine. You don't have to worry about it. But if they do, remember the stretch is going to go across the short edge, the 6 inch. All right? Now, let's get started. We're going to start by cutting a 6 inch by 18 inch strip. And we'll cut 2 of those. So I have one strip for one side of the batting. We really can't call it the front and the back. Let's call it side A and side B, because they're both fronts. I've cut a strip for side A and a strip for side B. And I've used the same fabric on both sides, but you know, most of the time I don't. I like to make it completely different color-wise on one side of the quilt as the other. Just makes it more fun. But these are both the same fabrics, and I'm going to make a, let's call it a peanut butter sandwich. My batting is going to be the peanut butter right in the middle, and my strips are going to be the bread, and they're going to be right side out. And then I'm going to serge this all together. So let's go to the serger. Now I have a 4-thread serger, and I'm just going to keep my pieces even. It's a good idea not to use pins. You know, your serger does not like pins. And if you've ever tried to sew over a pin with a serger, you'll find that out. I'm going to just put my fabric under here, and I want to take a scant seam. It's set for just about 1/4 of an inch seam, but I want a little bit less than that because I don't want to cut my fabric and batting off. So instead of lining it up where you would normally line up your stitch, I'm just going to bring it in a little bit further, which means my stitches are going to hang off the end a little bit. And if you forget and take a full 1/4 inch seam, that's okay too. Like I say, I just don't like to cut off much fabric. And when we get to the end of one side, I'm just going to serge right off the end. And let's take a look and see what this looks like. Here's our serged edge, and you can see that we've got little loops coming off the end. That's because I took a scant seam, and that's the way it's supposed to look. And you'll see why we do that in just a minute. Now we want to serge all 4 edges so that this is what it now looks like. And I serge down one edge and then the opposite edge, and then I come across the corners. So there's no turning of corners in this technique. Okay, here's what we have. Now, if you don't have a serger, you have some kind of probably a zigzag stitch, or better yet, an overcast stitch. Either one of those you can use, but if you use a zigzag stitch, make sure it's a long stitch. You don't want a satin stitch. What you're trying to do is compress these edges so that you can now treat this as one layer of fabric. All right, now our next step is to take our piece, and now I'm going to work with strips that are longer for both A and B side. They're longer than my centerpiece, and that's important that they are. We don't want to cut them to actual size because when we're stitching with batting in there, it can contort the size a little bit, and we will trim it after we're done. So we put side A, right sides together to our sandwich. We take side B and put that right sides together with our sandwich. And then we have a strip of batting, and that goes underneath the whole thing. Remember that. Whether you use a sewing machine or a serger, the batting is underneath next to the plate. If you try and put it on top, your feed or your foot for your machine or serger is going to get caught in that batting. Now another thing that we want to do is remember to start up about an inch with our strips. So they're going to stick up and over our sandwich that's in the middle, both our strips and our batting. And we'll line it up. And now we're ready to go to the serger. Now before we took a scant stitch, remember the loops hung off over the edge? This time we're going to take a full 1/4 inch strip. And let's go and do that. So now I have my fabric right along my guide. If I'm cutting off anything, it's just traces of fabric. And just adjust it. Remember, we don't have it pinned, so you have to hold the layers together. We'll just stitch down until we're at the end of our center sandwich. And then those of you that have sergers know that you just can't stop stitching there. You have to turn your fabric and just sew off the edge. Okay, let's take a look at what we have now. We had our center. We have strip A, right sides together with the center, strip B, right sides together with the center, and batting. And we've serged it. Now the next step is to open these loose pieces out like this. And our stitching or our quilting is done. Now remember, we took a scant stitch at first, now a full stitch. The reason for that is we don't want any of the previous serged stitches to show. Now it's easy to check and to fix if we get it right now. If we go on and do the next step, then it's a little bit harder. And let's take a look right here. We can see some of the previous stitching, but just in this area, about a 3-inch area. So I'm just going to go back in that area and just take a little bit deeper stitch. I don't have to pull out stitches. I don't have to do anything if we catch it right now. So let's fold our fabric back and just go in, and now we'll stitch it right in that area just a little bit deeper. That means we'll be cutting off just a little bit of the stitch. Now, if you're using a sewing machine instead of a serger, this step of stitching on these new strips would be done with a straight stitch, and then you go back and do a zigzag and an overcast. And the reason you also need to overcast is because that compresses the seam allowance. Because when we do open it up, if those seam allowances aren't compressed by overcasting or serging, you're going to get a lot of bulk right in here, and it won't look good. So go ahead and serge them or stitch them, then overcast them. Now we'll open it up. I can't see any stitching, so I'm ready to go to my next step. And the next step is to either zigzag or serge the long edge. And we just smooth it out. Again, no pins. And we want to serge all 3 layers together. So I bring those edges together, and let's serge those. Again, this is a scant stitch. We want it hanging over the edge a little bit. That's so we won't have that problem of the stitches showing. And we won't have to use our blade to cut off the extra fabric. And again, if you're using a sewing machine, this would be an overcast stitch. So on a sewing machine, we go from an overcast stitch to compress layers to a straight stitch when we add new strips. With the serger, it's just the one step all the way. Now, of course, you'll notice we've got tails hanging off here. We don't want that. So now I'll trim it. And we want to keep our quilt square. So I'm going to line up a seam, one of the seam lines, with a line on the ruler. And with this edge already serged or overcast. And cut our piece away. And now we'll come over and cut this piece. Again, line it up with a seam line and with this edge, and cut our piece. Now, of course, these quilts are square, or really they're rectangular, and we want to keep them that way. So the next step is really important. We need to serge these loose ends or overcast them, but we need to do it from this edge, this outside edge, in toward this center. Let me just show you what happens if there's a little extra fabric. See how it just comes into the fold right here? Whereas if we stitched here, can you see how we might not get a square corner? And that's important. So we want to stitch in. So let me just do one side of this. And just let the fabric feed right in. You don't have to come all the way across. When you get to that center seam, you can just serge off or overcast off. Now the next step is to put these same fabrics, unless you're really wild with your quilt and want every piece in it to be a different fabric. I'm going to use these same fabrics on the other side of this center piece. And again, we put it right sides together on side A, right sides together on side B, and the batting underneath. And we'll serge this. And then do the same steps. Serge it. What do we do next? We check to make sure we don't see any seams. We open it up. We serge the long edge or overcast it, trim the short edges, and then serge or overcast from the outside in. Now, a question I get asked a lot of times when I'm teaching this is, why do we even serge this outside edge? It's going to be covered up with more strips. Well, when I first started doing those, I didn't do that step. And you know, it got to the point where a lot of times I wasn't catching all the layers when I went to the next step. So by serging this outside edge, we really are dealing with one piece of fabric now because it's connected. Otherwise, we would be dealing with 3 fabrics here, 4, 5, 6 different layers, trying to keep them all lined up. And believe me, it's much easier to do this step, serge the edge, then you don't have to worry about that fabric or the 3 layers of the fabric. Okay, when we get that done, then our next step is to go across the edge in the same way. Now, some of you have made log cabin quilts. Really what we're doing is making one large log cabin block, only we're making it reversible. And if you've probably figured out by now, the quilting is done when we add these strips. There's no extra quilting. So we've even shortened that. So we have our center and 2 side pieces. What we want to do then is to add a piece across here, our A strip, right sides to that side. See, I'm continuing my color in sort of what we call a ring around that center. So A side, we have B sides, right sides together, and a strip of batting. And we would serge it, open it up and check it. If we don't see any seams, we would then open all of them out and serge the long edge, trim the short edge, and serge the short edge. And we can keep doing this until the quilt's as big as we want to. In my seminars, I joke around with it, and I say you can keep going until you run out of fabric, or the baby's born if it's for a baby, or whatever the occasion, because there's no right size to these. Now, let's take a look again at this piece, at this quilt that's finished. We have 2 different ways to finish the edge of our piece. We can either serge around the edge with a decorative thread, and the way that we do that is to curve the corners instead of keeping them square. And then in the loopers, the upper and lower looper, we put some decorative thread like I have here. This is a real nice rayon thread. It gives a nice edge. It's variegated. And we serge around. But let me show you what we do first. I'm going to take the rotary cutter. We're going to pretend this quilt is finished. I need to make a window just here. So what I've done is cut off about a 2-inch piece of the serging on the outside edge. And then we'll start serging in here, because with the decorative thread, we don't want this outside serging to show. So we cut a little window. You can curve the edges if you want to this way, or you can let the serger curve them because it'll cut it off. Let me just show you how we can do that. We need to just stick that window we cut out here. We'll just serge, cutting off all the previous serging. When we come close to the corner, you can just curve it, curve our edge, and keep going down the side. And let's take a look at the edge that we get. You can see how it will just curve the edge for you, or as I said, you can trim that off first. Then when we come around, I just serge until I completely cover this beginning stitch that I have here. Just serge for about 1 inch and then trim. And I take one of the strings of the serging thread and we weave it back through. You can just do that by hand. And then a touch of some kind of a sealant, a seam sealant, will just lock that in and your quilt is finished. Now, if you want to put a binding on, like I have on this quilt, let's just take this one off here. Here I have one that's more for boys, I guess. We've got soccers and footballs and all those things. But this has a traditional binding on. And let me just show you how we'll do that. I want to work with a double binding, and I want to use a 1/2 inch finished edge. So I'm going to cut a strip 3 inches wide, a binding strip, and fold it in half. So it's now 1.5 inches, and I'm going to take a large needle or a pin, put it into my ironing pad, slip the binding strip under it. Let me just straighten that out. And down on the other side, so my strip can go right through it. I'm going to pull it a little bit and put the iron on and pull it a little bit more and put the iron there and then just pull. And I have a perfectly folded binding strip to put onto my quilt. And then I wanted to take my strip that's already done this way, and I'm going to put on a mitered binding. Let's just take this piece here. So you have 2 different ways that you can finish your quilt. And I just wanted to show you the mitered corner, so I'm going to leave a tail and just sew right here. And yes, we can do this with a serger, or you can do it with a sewing machine. So let's put it on with a serger, because we promised you an all serger quilt. Okay, we just serge till we're a seam allowance, and a seam allowance in a serger is always 1/4 inch, because it's not how much you take off or anything, it's the actual seam allowance that's left on the fabric. So we serge until we're 1/4 inch from the next edge, and then by lifting the presser foot and lifting up the needle a little bit, we can turn our whole quilt until the corner is facing me, and we can serge right off the corner, and that should give us a miter. And let's take a look at it. We can come up now and bring our binding strip up. We can bring it down, and now we'll start mitering right at the corner, and then I'll show you how we can get a mitered binding on here. Okay, here we have our mitered front. We can bring it to the back, and we get a miter on the back of our quilt, and then we would finish it by hand. Now let's take a look at some of the other quilts that we have made, the 6-hour quilts. And I know if you just jump in and do them, they'll become one of your favorites. And you can make a lot of quilts in a hurry so that anybody who needs a quilt can have one. Thanks so much for being with me today, and I hope you'll be back and join me on the next Kaye's Quilting Friends. Thanks so much.
For information on today's main demonstration, call 1-800-248-KAYE. That's 1-800-248-5293. Or write to us at Kaye's Quilting Friends, Post Office Box 456, West Branch, Michigan 48661. Please remember to specify the program number. Kaye's Quilting Friends is brought to you in part by Janome America, American Professional Quilting Systems, Fiskars, and Quilters Rule International. Our thanks for joining us for this edition of Kaye's Quilting Friends. We hope the ideas shared with you in this program will make your quilting more enjoyable. Please join us again on the next Kaye's Quilting Friends.